Okay, today we're going to be talking about the networks of trade, sort of building on when we went over with our the basics of trade, which I talked about earlier on that previous lecture. You're going to have to please excuse the contributions from my dog Sam again, who's at this point, I think, chewing on his bone. But okay, hopefully that'll just remain in the background. Possibly you can't even hear it. Okay, so we've got three big networks of trade in this period of time. We've got the Silk Road going across Eurasia. You've got the Trans-Saharan Caravan routes going across Africa, and you've got the Indian Ocean Trade Network going across the Indian Ocean. And if you look at this map, in particular that area bound in green, what you are looking at is the reality that this trade network basically binds together all of Eurasia. Not necessarily directly taking place in it, and actually, I'm sorry, I should have said Eurasia, Africa. And not every individual piece of it takes place directly in it, but in one way or another, all of them are tied into this trade network. So if you want a world trade network or any kind of world connection in this time period, this is going to be as close as it comes. Obviously, not including the Americas, not including Australia. But for the world, as most people knew it in this period of time, this is it. Okay, long-distance trade. Just a reminder of the basics we talked about before. It's focused on valuable, portable, preservable goods. In other words, you have to be able to trust that it's going to get safely from one place to another. So it's less likely to be, it can't be something that's going to rot. So if it's like a fruit that rots quickly, that's not going to work. It's got to be something that is of high enough value in a small amount that it's worth transporting. So like, for example, grain, which is valuable in large amounts because each individual piece of it's not that valuable, but the whole is valuable. That's not a good subject for long-distance trade. It's going to be too hard to get it out of there. And it can't be too fragile, though in fact, glass, china, things that we would look at and see as highly fragile were actually good subjects of trade when you knew how to pack them and transport them properly. So I guess fragileness is something of a variable of how you choose to define it. That means that things like silks, rare metals and minerals, spices, salts, those kinds of luxury items were seen as highly attractive items of trade. Not always for the reasons we might guess. So, for example, spices, in some extent, they were transported for food, which is what we're accustomed to thinking in terms of them, but they were also transported as possible medicines, was one of the major reasons for using them. So, those kinds of goods are the objects of long-distance trade. Transportation. Very few roads, which means that if you're going somewhere, you've got to go by foot, you got to go by animal, or you got to go by water. Water's the easiest, water's the quickest generally, but water doesn't go everywhere. And so if water is not available, you've got to do it by animal or by foot. And even if you're traveling by animal, it may well be that it's more valuable or more important to put your goods on the backs of the animals, the horses you have, and you walk along beside them. Because it's more important to get as many goods as possible to sell than it is to actually try to, allow you to have a rest from your walking by riding on the animal's back. The caravan, obviously, that you're looking at there, it's not a real caravan. It's actually modern travelers, but just to give you a sense of what that might have vaguely looked like. Okay, so the first of the three large trade routes and the smallest of the three was the one that occupied Africa. The critical thing about it is that it links the northern trade system to the southern Saharan trade system. The big thing with Africa historically has been the Sahara Desert, crossing the Sahara Desert. And I don't know if you remember this being covered when we were talking about Egypt, but one of the big things about Egypt was because the Nile River allowed you to travel down, basically not having the problem of the desert, and get from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt being southern Africa, or more southern Africa, down where Nubia was, and then Lower Egypt, of course, being Egypt proper. Later on, they find ways of going across the Sahara Desert. But still, you have that division there. And so the big thing about the trans-Saharan caravan routes is linking the economy of northern and southern trade routes together. Some of the biggest goods would be gold from West Africa, for salt from the southern Sahara, for copper and manufactured goods that come out of North Africa. Camels are what makes it all possible. And in one of those weird historical bits, there were originally camels in Africa, but the camels in Africa died out. So they had to import new camels from Arabia. And in fact, they were specially bred and so that they become adaptable to the Saharan. So they're not the same camels as you end up later on in Arabia, but they're actually from there ancestrally. Basically, the point is that the camels make it all work. And they make it possible, but they're not necessarily the most agreeable of animals, as this gentleman seems to be finding out as he's trying to, I think, get close to that camel, perhaps to ride on it. Okay, the people who live in the deserts, the nomads in this case, are the Berbers. And actually, they're a separated people in the sense that they're the people who trade across the desert. In the case of the northern Berbers, they tend to live in the northern city-states, so they're urbanized. The southern Berbers are nomads who remain in the deserts, but they're the guides, they're the guards, the people who help caravans get across the desert, lead them across the desert for trade. In the case of bad times, they can also be the people who attack the caravans. The trans-Saharan caravan routes make the West African kingdoms possible. And so these sort of kingdoms in West Africa, Ghana, Mali, there's a number of others that follow, but they're built on control of these caravan routes because they bring in tax revenues, because they bring in the wealth from the trade that takes place, because they control the gold trade. And that makes them very wealthy kingdoms, and it gives them the wealth that the kings need to build up their militaries and import horses and become powerful cavalry forces as well. So both they get the wealth from the trade, but also what the wealth from the trade can buy them and how they can use it. It's a two-way process, by the way. The trade is what makes the West African kingdoms wealthy, but also they know that. And so they also play an important role in keeping that West African trade, caravan trade, safe, dependable. If you're a merchant, you know you're not going to get robbed, you're not going to get cheated, that you're going to have certain protections, and that's because the kings know where their wealth comes from, and they know what they need to preserve. Oh, one last thing is the wealth of these kingdoms, because of that, is known widely. And so in that picture, what you're looking at is an illustration from a Spanish map showing West Africa, and sort of the symbol of West Africa that they have there is the kingdom of Mali, and there's the king of Mali, and of course his gold nugget in his hand. Indian Ocean Maritime System. Basically, this is a fancy way of saying the Indian Ocean, the sailing routes across the Indian Ocean. There's 3 regions: the South China Sea, the east coast of India to the islands of Southeast Asia, and then the west coast of India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa. Please don't try to write those down. You don't need to know the details of it, but just keep in mind that there's sort of these 3 regions, basically divided by India in the middle. If there's a center to this trade, that's India. The merchants are what makes this possible, and they are scattered around the Indian Ocean. And so you have to have contacts from city to city. So let's say you're a merchant in Baghdad, and you're trying to arrange trade with, let's say, Calicut in India. You've got to come up with a way of deciding that you can trust this person, because you're talking about trade that's going to take years, that you're going to have to trust that you're going to get the goods back in exchange for what you've asked, that what the money that you're investing is simply not disappearing into the possibility, disappearing somewhere. Granted, there's a fair amount of risk involved anyways. There's shipwreck, pirates, various things can happen. But you have to be able to trust to some extent the person you're trading with as well. So there's some different ways you can try to ensure this. One way is by family. So you send off your youngest brother or your youngest nephew or grandson. You probably are getting a sense here that what we're talking about is sending off the maybe least valuable family member, in the sense of the the one that you can bully into going off to Calicut. But you send them off and you set them up, and they set up in Calicut, and so you can depend on this person you're trading with because their family is the hope. Alternatively, maybe you do it through ethnic religious connections. So Jewish merchants, Armenian merchants, Muslim merchants. You in that case, if let's say you're a Jewish merchant in Baghdad and you're trading in Calicut, the man that you're trading with in Calicut may not be a family member, but you're a fairly tight-knit group of Jewish merchants, and so his reputation among other merchants, and also that if he cheats you, you have the option of bad-mouthing him and basically destroying his reputation. And if you destroy his reputation, he's not going to get more business. And so the hope is therefore he'll deal with you fairly in order to protect his reputation. On a larger level, you have the growing Muslim network of merchants that is talked about in the textbook, which is on a much larger scale than we're talking about the Jewish or the Armenian networks. But same kind of concept. The idea is that you share a religious network, a religious connection, and that's hopefully going to make you more reliable. Because the Muslim network is larger, because it's more formalized, in many cases, actually, some of the areas you're trading within are actually part of the same, are ruled by Muslim rulers. There's also Muslim courts that you can go to. And so you have the option of legal recourse. If there's a problem that goes wrong with your trade, you can actually challenge him and hope for some kind of justice. So you try to come up with these ways of making connections and making trustworthy connections for trade. An additional piece of it also tends to be that you make local connections through marriage. And so it's very common for merchants to marry locals. Those marriages may be seen often as marriages that are for the time that you're in the area. So you may expect, with our young man who went to Calicut, you may expect eventually to go back to Baghdad. And probably when you go back to Baghdad, your wife and her kids are staying in Calicut, quite probably. They're not expecting to leave. A marriage like that could be valuable to the merchant because it allows you to learn the local language. It gives you an in. Quite commonly, you marry a woman who has brothers in the trade. In certain areas where women are merchants as well, you may marry a woman who is a merchant herself, and that gives you connections. It could also be valuable to the family themselves because it's a connection with a merchant. It helps build their trade networks as well. And so those kinds of marriages were very, very common. But as you get a sense, this whole sort of interconnected network of trade is based on trying to build ties of family, trying to build ties of religion, trying to build ties of ethnicity. It's all about making profit, but you've got to come up with some way of trusting the people that you're hoping to make a profit with. Navigation across the Indian Ocean, one of the critical things that makes it possible is knowledge of the winds. You've got the monsoons, which blow only one direction depending on the time of year. which is a really critical part of transport from India and to the west, but also the desire to know. You have to know the areas that you're going to sail through as well as possible. And even then, storms happen, miscalculations happen, winds happen that blow you off course. And so shipwrecks, storms, various forms of destruction were a fairly common part of this kind of travel. Though they do develop some of the earliest navigation tools to help with this kind of sailing, using the stars, using charts, using that kind of information. By the way, also, the information on how to sail and where to sail was extremely valuable. And so a pilot, for example, who knew this kind of information well, who was experienced, was a very valuable person to have on your side to direct your ship. It's also why in the early years, some of the first accounts we have of Indian Ocean trade are sort of one of the problems you face in reading them is that intentionally often they'll include misinformation. The idea being that the people who wrote them don't want to tell too much or make it too easy for rivals to try to follow in their footsteps and take over their trading operations. So they'll include in their descriptions of what was out there a fair amount of lies. The third trade network is the Silk Road, linking Eurasia basically together over land through caravans. And the Silk Road actually has received a fair amount of attention from historians and more popular attention of late as well, as this map sort of indicates. It should also give you a sense of some of the wide variety of goods that traveled along the Silk Road. Silk Road was possible because of camels and horses. Those are what makes the travel along these caravans possible. By the way, horses in particular are also a very valuable good that's traded along the caravan routes of the Silk Road. So one of the goods that they're trading for are horses, which have the advantage of you don't have to transport them, they sort of transport themselves. Basically, along the grasslands and deserts of Central Asia, Eurasia that you're traveling across, what makes this possible is the various caravan towns and cities that grow up. And in many cases, these are cities and towns that basically depend on the trade routes for their living. That's what makes it possible for them to survive, is that the caravans that come, that trade there, that exchange goods there, and that's really what their towns or cities are built upon. And some of these became extremely rich, amazing places that they've begun to do some really interesting archaeology and finding out more about. One more thing to keep in mind when we talk about this is that religion follows trade. And so if you look at the case of Buddhism, Buddhism spreads in Asia following the trade routes. It goes from India up into Central Asia and across into China. It also spreads along the trade routes in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, into Southeastern Asia as well through those routes. Later on, Islam does the same, spreading along the trade routes in Africa, along the caravan routes across the Sahara Desert. It spreads through the trade routes in the Indian Oceans, down the east coast of Africa, converting many of the people of the Swahili coast to Islam. It travels into India. It travels across all the way to China, along the way converting some groups as well. So one of the basic things that trade brings is the spread not just of the search for profit, but other kinds of things follow it as well. Is not just religion, though that's one big one that we can trace, but also ideas, technologies, a whole wide variety of things. And if we look at the history of the world, one of the motivating forces has been trade, not just for what it brings in itself, but for the various ideas, religions, other kinds of things that follow along behind.